Elegy for Rose by Tennessee Williams.
She is a metal forged by love, too volatile, too fiery thin, so that her substance will be lost as sudden lightning or as wind.
And yet the ghost of her remains reflected with the metal gone, a shadow as of shifting leaves at moonrise or at early dawn.
A kind of rapture, never quite possessed again, however long. The heart lays siege upon a ghost, recaptured in a web of song.
New York Times, September 7, 1996. Rose Williams, Tennessee Williams' sister, the model for Laura Wingfield, the lame young woman in the glass menagerie, died on Thursday in New York. A lawyer for the Tennessee Williams Trust reported the cause as cardiac arrest. She was 86. The playwright's authorized biographer, Lyle Leverick, wrote, throughout his life, Tennessee Williams had two overriding devotions, his career as a writer and his sister, Rose.
Broadway Playbill, September 10th, 1996. Rose Isabel Williams, Tennessee Williams' sister, who was the model for the character of Laura Wingfield in The Glass Menagerie and who is echoed in many other Williams characters, died September 6th of cardiac arrest at age 86. Raised in the same stressful household as her brother, Thomas, later called Tennessee, Rose spent most of her life in mental institutions following a prefrontal lobotomy authorized by her mother in 1943. It was Tennessee's belief that his sister's growing instability was caused, in no small part, by the strains between her strict Victorian upbringing and Rose's powerful but bottled-up sexual desires. A theme he explores in his play, Summer in Smoke, which is currently being revived on Broadway.
The Independent of the United Kingdom, Thursday, 12 September 1996. The troubled life of Rose Williams haunts the works of her brother Tennessee. Like a faded southern belle eternally deserted, she is the model for the withdrawn disabled Laura, who seeks refuge in her collection of glass animals in the Glass Menagerie. A dysfunctional family background influenced Williams's work, and his backward-looking, overheated Southern Gothic of regret and frustrated passion is suffused with the spirit of Rose. Rose grew up outgoing, but by early teenage, her good spirits turned into a kind of hysteria. She fought bitterly with her father. She lacked self-confidence, and her failure to stick at secretarial jobs was diagnosed by her psychiatrist as a fear of sex.
A letter to Rose, November 19th, 1927. Dear Rose, Aunt Belle sent us a letter giving a list of your engagements, and believe me, you are certainly going to be busy. You are probably right this minute at that tea which Auntie is giving for you. If you're not too tired when you get this, write us a letter and tell us how it went off. We are intensely interested, of course. Mother and Dad were out last night and are going out again tonight, imposing on me, making me stay in with Dakin 2 nights in succession on the weekend. I think I shall choke Dakin tonight and go out anyway. Dad tried your bed night before last, but he didn't sleep well on it, so last night he went back to his own, saying that yours brought him bad luck. While he was in your room, he demanded an explanation of all your cosmetics left in the closet. He was shocked at the number. He seems to have no understanding of feminine frivolities. You will be glad to know that I am sticking to my own neat little hole in the wall, and I'm not desecrating your sanctified boudoir. We miss greatly the clatter of kettles, hissing of steam, and splash of water which signify your presence in the house. Except when Dakin is hammering, or my typewriter clicking, everything is deathly still. We are all sensible to your absence. With love to Aunt Belle and Ella, and wishing you the happiest time of your life, yours lovingly, Tom.
A memory play can be presented with unusual freedom of convention because of its considerably delicate material. Atmospheric touches and subtleties of direction play a particularly important part in telling the story. These unconventional techniques have only one aim, and that is a closer approach to truth. So began Tennessee Williams' production notes for his first Broadway play, The Glass Menagerie. And the play most often associated with any discussion of Rose and Tennessee's family life. Tonight, we will use similar unconventional techniques to create another memory play. A memory play of Rose, as told through the writings of Tennessee Williams. The aim? A closer approach to truth.
Truth.
A closer approach to truth.
Truth.
A closer approach to truth about the family that was so central to his themes, character, and life.
The Glass Menagerie. Tom enters dressed as a merchant sailor from the alley, stage right, and strolls across the front of the stage to the fire escape. There he stops and lights a cigarette. He addresses the audience.
Yes, I have tricks in my pocket, I have things up my sleeve, but I am the opposite of a stage magician. He gives you illusion with the appearance of truth. I give you truth in the pleasant disguise of illusion. To start with, I turn back time. The play is a memory. Being a memory, it is dimly lit, it is sentimental, it is not realistic. In memory, everything seems to happen to music. That explains the fiddle in the wings. I'm the narrator of the play, but I'm also a character in it. The other characters are my mother, Amanda, my sister Laura, and a gentleman caller who appears in the final scenes. Now, he is the most realistic character in the play, being an emissary from the world of reality, a world that we found ourselves somehow separated from. But since I have a poet's weakness for symbols, I'm also using him as a symbol. He is that much delayed but often anticipated something that we live for in life. There is a fifth character that does not appear. That is our father, a man who left us a very long time ago. He was a telephone man who fell in love with long distances.
In 1973, Tennessee wrote a book called Memoirs. He was not, as he was quick to warn us, at his best mentally or physically when he wrote the book. And though he purported to tell the story of his life, he chose instead to write about sexual adventures and glancing encounters with the great, ignoring entirely the art and inner life of one Tennessee Williams. He does, however, introduce us to most of the characters that he wrote about in one way or another for all of his life. There is the hard-drinking, extroverted father Cornelius, at odds with the relentlessly genteel wife Edwina, and the daughter Rose, who may or may not have accused the father of making sexual advances, which he may or may not have made, and on whom a lobotomy was performed, effectively erasing her as a person. Finally, there is the son Tom, who is understandably shadowy even in his own memoirs. After all, he is creator. Fortunately for us, The Man in the Overstuffed Chair, the short story from which you're about to hear, has given as precise an account of Tennessee's early life as he ever wrote. And it gives us a chance to look at the father whose absence, or perhaps presence, began it all.
The Man in the Overstuffed Chair by Tennessee Williams. He always enters the house as though he were entering it with the intention of tearing it down from the inside. That is how he always enters it, except when it's after midnight and liquor has put out the fire in his nerves. Then, Cornelius enters the house in a strikingly different manner, almost guiltily coughing a little, sighing louder than he coughs, and sometimes talking to himself as someone talks to someone after a long, fierce argument has exhausted the anger between them, but not settled the problem. He takes off his shoes in the living room before he goes upstairs, where he has to go past my mother's closed door. She never fails to let him know she hears him by clearing her throat very loudly or saying,
"Oh, me. Oh, me."
Sometimes I hear him say, "Ah, me," in response, as he goes down on the hall to where he sleeps, in an alcove sunroom connected to the bedroom of my young brother Dakin, who was at this time, the fall and winter of 1943, with the Air Force. I have come this late autumn because my mother wrote me.
Your grandmother has had to give up the house in Memphis because she is not strong enough to take care of it, and your grandfather too.
Between the lines, I read that my mother is expecting the imminent death of her mother, and I ought to stop in St. Louis on my bus trip between the west and east coasts. So I have stopped.
So I have stopped. But only my grandmother has stayed up to receive me at this midnight hour. She makes light of her illness. She has kept a dinner plate on the stove for me, and the living room fire is alive. Gran says she's come here to help Edwina, my mother, who is suffering from nervous exhaustion and is very disturbed over my father's behavior. He has been drinking heavily. Mother found 5 empty bottles under his bed and several more under the bathtub. His position as sales manager of a branch of the International Shoe Company is in jeopardy due to a scandalous poker fight in which half his left ear was bitten off. Yes, actually bitten off. So that he had to go to a hospital and have a plastic surgery operation, taking cartilage from a rib to be grafted onto the ear. And in spite of elaborate precautions to keep it under wraps, the story has come out. My grandmother is telling me about these things because Edwina may be inclined to exaggerate the family situation when we talk in the morning. And now I ought to go up to bed after a long, hard trip. Yes, I ought to indeed.
I ought to indeed. I will have to sleep in my brother Dakin's old room rather than in my usual retreat in the attic, since the bed in the attic has been dismantled, so I won't insist on sleeping up there and getting pneumonia. I don't like the idea of taking Dakin's room, since it adjoins my father's doorless alcove to it. Strange sounds come from my father's sunroom, great sighs and moans and inebriate exclamations of sorrow. He is unaware of my sleepless presence in the room adjoining. From time to time, he lurches and stumbles out of bed to fetch a bottle of whiskey from some place of naive concealment. At last, I take a sleeping pill so that my exhaustion can prevail over my tension and my curiously missed feelings of disgust and pity for my father, Cornelius Coffin Williams, the Mississippi drummer who was removed from the wild and free road and put behind a desk, like a jungle animal put in a cage in a zoo.
Like a jungle animal put in a cage in a zoo.
At supper the following evening, an awful domestic scene takes place. My father is one of those drunks who never stagger or stumble, but turn savage with liquor. And the next evening after my homecoming, he comes home late and drunk for supper. He sits at one end of the table, my mother at the other. She fixes on him her look of silent suffering, like a bird dog drawing on a bead of quail in the covey in the bushes. All at once, he explodes into maniacal fury. His shouting goes something like this: "What the hell? Why the hell do you feel so sorry for yourself?" I stay rooted or frozen to the dining room chair. The food is turning sick in my stomach. Silence. My father crouches over his plate, eating it like a wild beast at its kill in the jungle. Silent still. His inflamed blue eyes are
suddenly filled with tears. He lurches up from the table and goes to the overstuffed chair in the living room.
I don't remember just when we got it. Its color was originally blue, plain blue. Time has altered the blue to something sadder than blue, as if it had absorbed in its fabric and stuffing all the sorrows and anxieties of our family life. And these emotions have become its stuffing and its pigmentation, if chairs can be said to have pigmentation. It doesn't really seem like a chair, though. It seems more like a fat, silent person, not silent by choice, but simply unable to speak, because if it spoke, it would not get through a sentence without bursting into a self-pitying wail. Over this chair stands another veteran piece of furniture, a floor lamp that rises and curves over his head. It has a silk lampshade with a fringe about it, so it suggests a weeping willow, which is presumably weeping for the occupant of the chair. My father remains there, talking to himself.
It would be false to say that he was ever outwardly kind to his fantastic older son, myself. But I suspect that he knew that I would be more and more like him as I grew older, and that he pitied me for it. A psychiatrist once said to me, "You will begin to forgive the world when you've forgiven your father." I'm afraid it's true that my father taught me to hate, but I don't think that he planned to. And as terrible as it is to know how to hate and to hate, I've forgiven him for it, and for a great deal more. Sometimes I wonder if I've ever forgiven my mother for teaching me to expect more love from the world, more softness in it than it could ever offer.
Memoirs.
Memoirs.
Memoirs by Tennessee Williams.
The story of my sister Rose's tragedy begins. I have mentioned that Rose suffered for several years from mysterious stomach trouble. She was hospitalized several times for this digestive trouble, but no ulcer, no physical cause for the illness could be determined.
It was recommended that she have an exploratory operation.
Luckily, our family doctor, a brilliant physician, intervened at this time point and told my mother, much to her dismay, that it was his quite accurate opinion that Rose needed psychiatric attention, the mysterious digestive upset being due, he thought, to psychosomatic reasons that could be determined only through the course of analysis.
You can imagine how this struck Miss Edwina.
It was about this time that our wise old family doctor told Mother that Rose's physical and mental health depended upon what struck Miss Edwina as a monstrous thing, a sort of therapeutic marriage.
Obviously, old Doc Alexander had hit upon the true seat of Rose's afflictions.
She was a very normal but highly sexed girl who was tearing herself apart mentally and physically by those repressions imposed upon her.
The Resemblance Between a Violin Case and a Coffin by Tennessee Williams. With her advantage of more than 2 years and the early maturity of girls, my sister moved before me into a country of mysterious differences where children grow up. And although we naturally continued to live in the same house, she seemed to have gone on a journey while she remained in sight. The difference came about more abruptly than you would think possible, and it was vast. It was like the two sides of the river that ran through the town we lived. The rumbling wooden bridge that joined those banks was hardly shorter than the interval in which my sister moved away from me. Her look was startled, mine was bewildered and hurt. Either there was no explanation or none was permitted between the one departing and the one left behind. The earliest beginning of it that I can remember was one day when my sister got up later than usual and had an odd look. Not as if she'd been crying, but as though she had received some painful, frightening surprise. And I observed an equally odd difference in the manner toward her of my mother and grandmother. She was escorted to the kitchen table for breakfast as though she were in danger of toppling on either side. She was addressed in hushed and solicitous voices, almost the way docile servants speak to employer. I was baffled and a little disgusted. I received no attention at all, and the one or two glances given me by my sister had a peculiar look of resentment in them.
It was a Saturday morning, a hot yellow day, and it was the hour when my sister and I would ordinarily take to the streets on our wheels. But that custom was now disregarded. After breakfast, my sister was escorted to the parlor and encouraged to sit down at the piano. She spoke in a low, whimpering tone to my grandmother, who adjusted the piano stool very carefully and placed a cushion on it, and even turned the pages of sheet music for her as if she were incapable of finding the place for herself. I hung around the parlor a little while, and when I finally said to Gran, "Why can't she practice later?" as if I'd made some really brutal remark, my sister jumped up in tears and fled to her upstairs bedroom.
It was in this way was instituted our time of estrangement, and it seemed that mother and grandmother were conspiring to increase it.
They continually asked me why I didn't make friends with other children.
I was ashamed to admit that my sister's wild imagination and inexhaustible spirits made all other substitute companions seem like shadows of shade.
Sometimes I think she might have fled back into the more familiar country of childhood if she'd been allowed to. But the grown-up ladies of the house were continually telling her that such and such a thing was not proper for her to do. It was not proper for my sister not to wear stockings, to crouch in the yard at a place where the earth was worn bare, to bounce a rubber ball and pick up starry-pointed bits of metal called jacks. It was not even proper for me to come into her room without knocking. All of these proprieties struck me as mean and silly, and the wound of them turned me inward.
My sister had been magically suited to the wild country of childhood, but it remained to be seen how she would adapt herself to the more complex world that grown girls enter. For between childhood and adulthood, there is a terrain which is even wilder than childhood. Its wilderness, the interior. Those few years of dangerous passage take the breath sometimes and bewilder the vision. My mother and maternal grandmother came of a calmer blood than my sister and I. They were unable to suspect the hazards that we were faced. Irreconcilables fought for supremacy in us. Peace could never be made. Only a smoldering armistice reached after many battles.
Looking back on it, I see that those 2 or 3 years when the fatal dice were still tilted in the box were the years of her beauty. The long copperish curls which had swung below her shoulders, bobbing almost constantly with excitement, were unexpectedly removed one day. Mother took her downtown, and my sister returned without her long copper curls. It was like a formal acknowledgement of the sorrowful division which had haunted the house. She had now begun to imitate the walk of grown ladies, and she kept her arms at her side instead of flung out as if brushing curtains aside as she sprang forward in the abrupt lost days. But there was much more than that.
What I saw was a grown stranger whose beauty sharpened my sense of being alone. I saw it was all over. The magical intimacy of our childhood together, the soap bubble afternoons, and the games with paper dolls cut out of dress catalogs, and the breathless races here and there on our wheels. And it was then that I began to find life unsatisfactory as an explanation of itself, and I was forced to adopt the method of the artist, which is a rather fancy way of saying I started writing.
My sister had a separate occupation, which was her study of music, now entrusted to Miss Ailey, an almost typical spinster who lived in a small frame house with a porch covered by moonbines and a fence covered by honeysuckle. She supported herself and a paralyzed father by giving lessons in violin and piano, neither of which she played well, but for which she had great gifts as a teacher, or at least great enthusiasm. She had 2 real star pupils, my sister on the piano, and a boy named Richard Miles who studied violin. Richard Miles.
Richard Miles. Richard Miles. I think of him now as a boy, for he was about 17, but at the time he seemed a complete adult to me, even immeasurably older than my sister, who was 14. I resented him fiercely, even though I began, almost immediately after learning of his existence, to dream about him, as I had formerly dreamed of storybook heroes. My sister's obsession with Richard may have been even more intense than mine. Since mine was copied from hers, it was probably hers that was greater in the beginning. But while mine was shy and sorrowful, involved with my sense of abandonment, hers at first seemed to be joyous. She had fallen in love. As always, I followed suit. But while love made her brilliant at first, it made me laggard and dull. It filled me with sad confusion. It tied my tongue or made it stammer, and it flashed so unbearably in my eyes that I had to turn away.
My sister and Richard Miles were to play a duet. She on the piano, of course, and he on the violin. They practiced separately, and they practiced together. Separately, my sister played the piano piece very well, but for some reason, more portentous than it seemed at the time, she had great difficulty playing to Richard's accompaniment. Suddenly her fingers would turn to thumbs, and her beauty and grace would vanish.
Richard was patient. He was incredibly patient. He seemed to be far more concerned for my sister's sake than his own.
Extra hours of practice were necessary.
Sometimes they would continue at our house. When I heard them enter the door, or even before, when I heard their voices as they climbed the porch, I would open the door 2 inches, an aperture just enough to enclose the piano corner, and flatten myself on my belly on the cold floor, and remain in that position as long as they played, fearful of betraying their watch that I kept over them, while they practiced, and I hardly dared to breathe.
I would barely notice my sister at the piano, groan at her repeated blunders, but only in sympathy for him. When I recall what a little Puritan I was in those days, there must have been a shocking conflict between my thoughts and sensations as I gazed down upon Richard through the crack of the door.
Not that there was anything to be ashamed of in adoring the beauty of Richard. It was sure to be made for that purpose, and boys my age made to be stirred by such ideals of grace. The sheer white cloth in which I had originally seen his upper body was, in those afternoons, diaphanous with light. The torso shone through it, faintly pink and silver, the nipples on the chest and the armpits a little darker, and the diaphragm visibly pulsing as he breathed. It is possible that I have seen more graceful bodies, but I am not sure that I have. And his remains, I believe, a subconscious standard.
Looking back upon him now, I think of Camilla Rucellai, that high-strung mystic of Florence who is supposed to have fainted at the sight of Pico della Mirandola, entering the streets of that city on a milk-white horse in a storm of sunlight and flowers.
As she revived, she cried, "He will pass in the time of lilies," meaning that he would die early, since nothing so fair could decline by common degrees in a fated season.
The light was certainly there in all its fullness, and even a kind of flowers, at least shadows of them, for there were flowers of lace in the window curtains, and actual branches of fern, which the light projected across him, and the way he handled that violin. First he would roll up the sleeves of his white shirt, remove his necktie, and loosen his collar, as though he were making preparations for love. his hands in his arms as he lifted the violin from the case, said the word love more sweetly than speech could say it. No, what precocious fantasies their grace and tenderness would excite in me. I was a wounded soldier, the youngest in the regiment, and he, Richard, was my young officer, jeopardizing his life to lift me from the field where I had fallen and carry me back to safety in the same arms that supported his violin now. The dreams perhaps went a bit further.
I now feel some anxiety that this story will seem to be losing itself like a path that has climbed a hill and then lost itself in an overgrowth of brambles. The remaining very clear thing that you need to be told is the evening of the recital in mid-November. But before an account of that, I should tell more of my sister in this troubled state of hers.
One evening, I overheard a telephone call which Mother received from Miss Ailey, who was at first perplexed and now genuinely alarmed by the sudden decline of my sister's vaunted aptitude for the piano. Was she sleeping badly? How was her appetite? Was she very moody? Mother came away from the telephone in a very cross humor with the teacher. My grand had nothing to offer in the way of a practical solution except to say that perhaps it was a mistake for brilliant children to be pushed into things like this too early.
Richard stayed patient with her most of the time, and there were occasional periods of revival when she would attack the piano with an explosion of confidence, and the melodies would surge beneath her fingers like birds out of cages.
But there would be a stumble and then another collapse.
Once, Richard himself became unstrung. He pushed his violin high into the air, like a broom sweeping cobwebs off the ceiling. He strode around the parlor, brandishing it with groans that were both sincere and comic. She burst into tears and would have fled upstairs, but he caught hold of her, detaining her with murmurs I couldn't quite hear. He drew her gently back to the piano corner, and he sat down on the piano stool with his great hands gripping each side of her narrow waist while she sobbed. And while I watched from my cave of darkness, my body learned, at least 3 years too early, the fierceness and fire of will.
The evening of the recital, my sister complained at supper that her hands were stiff, and she kept rubbing them together and even held them over the spout of a teapot to warm them in the steam. She looked very pretty, I remember, when she was dressed.
She wore silver slippers and a very grown-up looking dress that was the greenish sea color of her eyes. It had the low waist that was fashionable at that time, and there were silver beads on it and fringes. Her bedroom was steaming from the adjoining bath. She opened the window.
Grandmother slammed it down, declaring that she would catch cold.
Oh, leave me be.
She answered. The muscles in her throat were curiously prominent as she stared in the glass.
Stop powdering,
Said my grandmother.
you're caking your face with powder.
Well, it's my face.
She retorted, and then came near to flying into a tantrum at some small critical comment offered by Mother.
I have no talent. I have no talent for music. Why do I have to do it? Why do you make me? Why was I forced into this?
Even my grandmother finally gave up and retired from the room. But when it came time to leave for the parish house, my sister came downstairs, looking fairly collected, and said not another word as we made our departure.
No, it did not go well.
She could not seem to remember the composition beyond the first few pages. But Richard was heroic. He seemed to anticipate every wrong note that she struck and cover and rectify it. When she began to lose control, I saw him edging closer to her position so that his radiant figure shielded her partly from view. And when it seemed the duet might collapse altogether, raise his bow high in the air, at the same time catching his breath in a sort of hum, a sound I heard much later from bullfighters daring a charge. He lowered the strings in a masterful sweep and took the lead from my sister and plunged them into the passage she had forgotten in her panic. For a bar or two, she sat there stunned. And then he murmured something to her. And she started again. Richard played so brilliantly, so richly, that the piano was barely noticeable underneath him. And when they finished, he received an ovation. My sister started to run for the cloakroom, but Richard seized her wrist and held her back. Then something odd happened. Instead of taking a bow, she suddenly turned and pressed her forehead against him, pressed it against the lapel of his blue serge suit. He blushed and bowed and touched her waist with his fingers, gently, his eyes glancing down.
We drove home in silence. My sister sat with her hands knotted in her lap, and when I looked at her, I noticed that her shoulders were too narrow and her mouth a little too wide for real beauty, and that her recent habit of hunching made her seem a little bit like an old lady being imitated by a child.
At that point, Richard Miles faded from our lives as my sister refused to continue studying music, and eventually we moved to the South. A year or so later, we learned that Richard had died of pneumonia. And then I remembered the case of the violin and how it so much resembled a little black coffin made for a child or a doll.
Memoirs.
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 Returning to St. Louis and the 30s.
Rose had a serious St. Louis beau. He was a junior executive where Dad worked, a young man of very personable appearance, social grace, and apparently of great and unscrupulous ambition. For a few months, he was quite attentive to Rose. They dated, I think, several times a week. They were almost going steady. And Rose would tremble when the telephone rang, desperately hoping the call was for her and that it was from him.
But the scandal occurred. The episode at the all-night poker party in which Dad lost an ear. This marked the beginning of the end for Dad's possible ascendancy to the board.
It also marked the end of Rose's dates with her handsome and unscrupulously ambitious beau, who was no longer interested in being a potential husband for Rose.
Her heart broke, and it was after that that the mysterious stomach trouble began.
One evening, Dad, seated in our gloomy little sunroom, called out to Rose.
"Sister, come here. I want to discuss something with you."
He told her that he was in danger of losing his job and that she must prepare herself for self-support. Somehow or other, precisely how I don't recall, she did obtain employment as a receptionist at the office of some young dentist.
The job lasted only one day and ended on the most pathetic note. She had been unable to address envelopes properly, and the young dentist discharged her. She fled weeping into the lavatory and locked herself in.
They called us at home and we had to go to the office to persuade her to leave her place of retreat.
Soon after, Rose was removed to the state asylum. I remember the first time we went to visit her.
Tom, let me show you my ward.
She conducted me through it. It was too awful to believe. All those narrow little cots and hard wooden benches. Under one of the benches was crouched a young girl in a catatonic condition.
Rose, what's wrong with her?
With no apparent discomposure, Rose replied, smiling,
She's on her bad behavior today, that's all.
I may have inadvertently omitted a good deal of material about the unusually close relationship between Rose and me. Some perceptive critic of the theater made the observation that the true theme of my work is incest. My sister and I had a close relationship, quite unsullied by any carnal knowledge. As a matter of fact, we were quite shy around each other physically.
There was no casual physical intimacy of the sort that one observes among the Mediterranean people in their family relations. And yet our love was, and is, the deepest in our lives, and was perhaps very pertinent to our withdrawal from extrafamilial attachments. There were years when I was a student at State University of Missouri when my sister and I spent nearly all our evenings together. What did we do?
Well, we strolled about the streets of University City. I think it was the Del Mar, which we strolled along in the evenings. There was a root beer stand at which we always stopped.
Rose was inordinately fond of root beer, especially on warm summer evenings.
And before and after our root beer stop, we would window shop.
Rose's passion was clothes. Rose did not have much of a wardrobe, and so her window shopping on Del Mar was like a hungry child's gazing through the window fronts of restaurants. Her taste in clothes was excellent. How about that dress, Rose?
Oh, no, that's tacky. But that one is nice. I have mentioned our dancing together.
Rose taught me to dance to the Victrola. Rose taught me to dance to the Victrola that had been acquired in Mississippi and shipped to St. Louis at the time of our disastrous family move there.
Dad had subleased our first real residence in St. Louis, a very charming two-story Georgian house.
The street was Pershing.
And across from our house was the home of Virginia Moore, a strikingly handsome poet of that time. She had a brother who took an interest in Miss Rose and dated her several times.
I recall having gone about town distributing political leaflets during that disastrous campaign of his. He lost the election.
And suddenly was confined in a sanitarium for a nervous breakdown.
When he was released from the
The
sanitarium,
poor man killed himself.
and Miss Rose lost yet another beau.
It was in the rented house on Pershing Miss Rose's mind began to slip. Not violently, but gradually.
I remember a drive in the country with young friends. We started to laugh at the outrageous behavior of an acquaintance who was losing his mind. Miss Rose turned very grave and stiff in the back seat of the car.
You must never make fun of insanity.
She said.
It's worse than death.
And that's exactly what Mother said when informed that Miss Rose had dementia praecox in 1937. It's not very pleasant to look back on that year and to know that Rose knew she was going mad, and to know also that I was not too kind to my sister. You see, for the first time in my life, I had become accepted by a group of young friends, and my delighted relations with them preoccupied me to such an extent that I failed to properly observe the shadow falling on Rose.
January 3rd, 1937, Ella Williams to her brother Cornelius Williams.
Rose seems perfectly well. Her mind is as clear as yours and mine. All that is wrong with her is that she's bored to death, with no interest.
January 14, 1937, Ella Williams to her sister-in-law, Edwina Williams.
Rose is fine. There's nothing the matter with her mind but lack of use. She needs to use her mind very badly. She needs an object in life, and she hasn't got it.
Dementia praecox, schizophrenia, mixed type, paranoid predominating. This was the diagnosis given to Rose Williams by the state hospital. Insulin, shock, and metrazole therapy were applied. After 6 years of unsuccessful treatment, Rose was given a bilateral prefrontal lobotomy. The year was 1943. The lobotomy was sanctioned by her mother, Edwina Williams. Tennessee had last seen his sister in 1939.
Tennessee's only comment was a journal entry in blank verse. Grand, God be with you. A cord breaking, 1,000 miles away. Rose, her head cut open. A knife thrust in her brain. Me, here, smoking. My father, mean as the devil, snoring. 1,000 miles away.
The lobotomy was a controversial procedure, even when it was a popular treatment for patients whose mental disorders were regarded by their caregivers as hopeless.
The procedure did, in fact, reduce many symptoms of mental disorder, but it came at the expense of the patient's ability to function independently.
Self-awareness was reduced.
Emotional functions dulled.
Intellectual capacity restricted.
In the late 1880s, doctors began removing parts of the brain to calm patients with schizophrenia. The procedure relieved symptoms, though there was a small problem. The patients kept killing themselves afterwards.
In 1936, Dr. Walter Freeman, a neurologist and psychiatrist,
But not a surgeon.
began performing lobotomies in the United States.
He popularized the procedure and co-performed more than 3,000 lobotomies using an ice pick.
Anesthesia optional.
The ice pick was inserted through an eye socket into the brain to achieve what he felt was the optimal amount of neural damage.
Dr. Freeman coined the term surgically induced childhood and used it to describe the desired results of a lobotomy.
According to Dr. Freeman, the operation changed the patient, rendering him
Or her,
more amenable to the social pressures under which he
or she,
is supposed to exist.
In 1948, MIT mathematician and philosopher Norbert Wiener wrote, "The prefrontal lobotomy has gained a certain vogue, probably not unconnected to the fact that it makes the custodial care of the patients easier. Let me remark, in passing, that killing them makes their custodial care easier still."
As to Rose Williams, therapists, academics, and medical researchers still argue today. Was she a delusional schizophrenic, autistic, unable to cope with a world for which she wasn't adequately prepared? Or was there something else behind her odd behavior?
Most prominent among the supposedly delusional statements Rose Williams made before she was institutionalized are her accusations of sexual immorality among her family, especially the notion that her father made sexual advances toward her.
Even if we are to accept the commonly held position that her father,
Who was, by all accounts, a violent and sexually promiscuous man,
did not sexually abuse Rose, we do not have to accept her stories as strictly delusional. Alternate explanations exist.
regardless, most experts agree that Rose Williams was subjected to treatments that aggravated her difficulties and may, in fact, have created a psychosis that was not previously there.
The impact of what happened to Rose influenced almost everything that Tennessee wrote from 1943 on.
Portrait of a Girl in Glass by Tennessee Williams.
And the Glass Menagerie.
We lived in a third-floor apartment on Maple Street in St. Louis, on a block which also contained an ever-ready garage, Chinese laundry, and a bookie shop disguised as a cigar store. Mine was an anomalous character, one that appeared to be slated for radical change or disaster, while I was a poet who had a job in a warehouse. As for my sister, Laura, she could be classified even less readily than I. She made no positive motion toward the world, but stood on the edge of the water, so to speak, with feet that anticipated too much cold to move. She'd never have budged an inch, I'm sure, if my mother had not shoved her roughly forward by enrolling her as a student in a nearby business college. It did not work out. Laura tried to memorize the typewriter keyboard. She used to sit silently staring at it while she cleaned and polished her infinite number of little glass ornaments. Mother would caution me to be very quiet.
Sister is looking at her typewriter chart.
I felt somehow that it would do no good, and I was right. She would seem to know the positions of the keys until the weekly speed drill got underway, and then they would fly from her mind like a bunch of startled birds. At last, she couldn't bring herself to enter the school anymore. She kept this failure a secret for a while. She left the house every morning as before and spent 6 hours walking around the park. This was in February, and all that walking around outdoors brought on influenza. She was in bed for a couple of weeks with a curiously happy little smile on her face.
What are we going to do? What is to become of us? What is the future?
Has something happened, Mother? Mother, has something happened?
I'll be all right in a minute. I'm just bewildered by life.
Mother, I wish you would tell me what's happened.
Well, as you know, I was supposed to be inducted into my office at the DAR this afternoon, but I stopped off at Rubicam's Business College to speak to your professor about your having a cold and ask him what progress they thought you were making down there.
Oh.
I went to the typing instructor and introduced myself as your mother. She didn't know who you were. Wingfield. She said, we don't have any student enrolled at the school by that name. Well, I assured her she did, that you have been going to classes since early in January. She said, I wonder if you could be talking about that terribly shy little girl who dropped out of school after only a few days' attendance. I said, oh, no. Laura, my daughter, has been going to school every day for the past 6 weeks. She took out the attendance book, and there was your name, unmistakably printed, and all the dates you had been absent until they decided that you had dropped out of school. $50 tuition. All of our plans, my hopes and ambitions for you just gone up the spout. Just gone up the spout like that.
Mother, when you're disappointed, you get that awful suffering look on your face like the picture of Jesus' mother in the museum.
What are we going to do the rest of our lives? Stay home and watch the parades go by? Amuse ourselves with the glass menagerie, darling? Eternally play those worn-out phonograph records your father left as a painful reminder of him? We won't have a business career. We've given that up. I know so well what becomes of unmarried women who aren't prepared to occupy a position. I've seen such pitiful cases in the South. Barely tolerated spinsters living upon the grudging patronage of sister's husband or brother's wife. Is that the future we've mapped out for ourselves? I swear it's the only alternative I can think of. It isn't a pleasant alternative, is it? Although some girls do marry. Haven't you ever liked some boy?
Yes, I liked one once.
Oh, a high school boy.
Yes, his name was Jim. He was in Pirates of Penzance.
The what?
The operetta the senior class put on. He had a wonderful voice. We sat next to each other, across from each other on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays in the auditorium. He called me Blue Roses.
Why did he call you such a name as that?
When I had that attack of pleurosis, he asked me what was the matter when I came back. I said pleurosis. He thought I said blue roses. So that's what he always called me after that. Whenever he saw me, he'd holler, "Hello, blue roses."
Sister, that's what we'll do. Girls who aren't cut out for business careers usually wind up married to some nice man.
But Mother,
Yes?
I'm crippled.
Nonsense, Laura. I told you never, never to use that word. Why, you aren't crippled. You just have a little defect. Hardly noticeable even. Why, when people have some slight disadvantage like that, they cultivate other things to make up for it. Develop charm and vivacity and charm. That's all you have to do. One thing your father had plenty of was charm.
After the fiasco at Rubicam's Business College, the idea of getting Laura a gentleman collar came to weigh more and more into my mother's calculations. It became an obsession, like some archetype of the universal unconscious. The image of a gentleman collar haunted our little apartment. Even when he wasn't mentioned, he was still present in my mother's preoccupied look or in Laura's frightened and apologetic manner. Hung like a sentence passed upon by the Wingfields. My sister kept in a bedroom mostly. There were 3 pieces of dingy ivory furniture in the room. Bed, bureau, chair. Over the bed was a remarkably bad religious painting, a very effeminate head of Christ, with teardrops visible just below the eyes. The charm of the room was produced by my sister's collection of glass.
She loved colored glass, and she had covered the walls with shelves of little glass articles, all of them light and delicate in color. She washed and polished with endless care.
When you entered the room, there was always this soft, transparent radiance in it, which came from the glass absorbing whatever faint light came through the shades. I have no idea how many articles there were of this delicate glass. There must have been hundreds of them. But Laura could tell you. She loved each one.
Laura lived in a world of glass and a world of music. The music came from a 1920 Victrola and a bunch of records that dated from about the same period. Pieces such as Whispering and Dardanella. These records were souvenirs of our father, a man whom we barely remembered, whose name was spoken rarely. Before his sudden and unexplained disappearance from our lives, he made this gift to the household, the phonograph and the records, whose music remained as sort of an apology.
Often, she would sing to those records in her bedroom. Her voice was thin and usually wandered off key.
Yet it had a curious, childlike sweetness.
I think that's why I always wrote such strange and sorrowful poems in those days, because I heard in my ears the wispy sound of my sister, serenaded her pieces of precious glass. I don't believe my sister was actually foolish.
I think the petals of her mind had simply closed through fear. And it's no telling how much they had closed upon in the way of secret wisdom.
She never talked very much, not even to me. But once in a while, she did pop out with something that took you by surprise. Like one time at Christmas while we were trimming the artificial tree. She picked up the Star of Bethlehem that was meant for the topmost branch and held it gravely toward the chandelier.
Do stars have 5 points, really?
This was the sort of thing that you didn't believe and that made you stare at Laura with sorrow and confusion. No, I told her. They're round like the earth and most of them bigger.
She was gently surprised by this new information.
She went to the window to look up into the sky, which was, as usual during St. Louis winters, completely shrouded by smoke.
It's hard to tell,
She said, and returned to the tree. Mother, you shouldn't expect so much out of Laura.
What do you mean?
Because she's ours and we love her, we don't even notice that she's crippled anymore.
Don't say crippled. You know I never allow that word to be used.
Face the facts, Mother, she is, and that's not all.
What do you mean, not all?
Laura is very different from other girls.
Well, I think the difference is all to her advantage.
Not quite all. To outsiders, to strangers, she lives in a world on her own, and she is very shy, and that makes her seem a little peculiar to anybody that lives outside of this apartment.
Don't say peculiar.
Face the fact, she is.
In what way is she peculiar, may I ask?
She lives in her own little world of glass ornaments. She listens to the phonograph and plays old records, and that's about it.
Where are you going?
To the movies.
Not to the movies. Every night to the movies? I don't believe you always go to the movies. Laura. Laura!
Yes, Mother?
Leave those dishes be and come in front. Laura, come here and make a wish on the moon.
Moon? Moon.
A little silver slipper of a moon, Laura. Look over your left shoulder and make a wish. Now, darling, wish.
What shall I wish for, Mother?
Happiness. Good fortune.
And so, the following evening, I brought home Jim for dinner. I knew that Jim and Laura had known each other in high school, and I had heard Laura speak admiringly of his voice. Didn't know if Jim remembered her or not. In high school, Laura had been as unobtrusive as Jim had been astonishing. If he did remember Laura, it was not as my sister. For when I asked him to dinner, he grinned and said,
You know, Shakespeare, I never thought of you as having folks.
he was about to discover that I did.
Laura's place was next to Jim at the drop-leaf table, and all through her meal her figure was slightly tilted away from his. Her face was feverishly bright, and one eyelid, the one on the side toward Jim, had developed a nervous wink. 3 times in the course of the dinner she dropped her fork on her plate with a terrible clatter, and she was continually raising the water glass to her lips for hasty little gulps. She went on doing this even after the water was gone from the glass, and her handling of the silver became more awkward and hurried all the time.
I thought of nothing to say.
To Mother belonged the conversational honors, such as they were. She asked the caller about his home and family. Then she started to talk about her children. Laura, she said, was not cut out for business. She was domestic, however, and making a home was really a girl's best bet.
Jim agreed with all this and seemed not to sense the ghost of an implication.
I suffered through it dumbly, trying not to see Laura trembling more and more beneath the incredible unawareness of Mother. And bad as it was, excruciating, in fact. I thought with dread of the moment when dinner was going to be over, for the diversion of food would be taken away and we would have to go into the little steam-heated parlor.
But when the dessert was finished, a miracle happened. Jim sauntered carelessly into the front room and flopped down on the floor beside the Victrola.
He began sorting through the collection of worn-out records and reading the titles aloud in a voice so hearty that it shot like beams of sunlight through the vapors of self-consciousness engulfing my sister and me.
What have you been doing, Law, since high school?
I don't do anything much. My glass collection takes up a good deal of time. Mother calls him a glass menagerie. Here's an example of one if you'd like to see it. This is one of the oldest. It's nearly 13. Oh, be careful. If you breathe, it breaks. You see how the light shines through him? I shouldn't be partial, but he is my favorite one.
A unicorn, huh? Aren't they extinct in the modern world? Poor little fellow. He must feel sort of lonesome.
Well, if he does, he doesn't complain about it.
I looked away quickly, not knowing whether to feel relieved or alarmed at the turn things were taking. Jim wound up the Victrola and put on Dardanella. He grinned at Laura.
How about you and me cutting the rug a little?
What?
Said Laura breathlessly, smiling and smiling.
Dance!
He said, drawing her into his arms. As far as I knew, she had never danced in her life.
But to my everlasting wonder, she slipped quite naturally into those huge arms of Jim's, and they danced, bumping against the sofa and chairs and laughing loudly and happily together. Something opened up in my sister's face. To say it was love is not too hasty a judgment.
Mother came back in with lemonade. She stopped short.
Good heavens! Laura dancing?
Her look was absurdly grateful as well as startled.
But isn't she stepping all over you, Mr. Delaney?
What if she does?
Said Jim with bearish gallantry.
I'm not made of eggs.
Well, well, well.
Said Mother, senselessly beaming.
She's light as a feather. With a little more practice, she'd dance as good as Betty.
There was a little pause of silence.
Betty?
Said Mother.
The girl I go out with.
Said Jim.
Oh. Mother set the pitcher of lemonade carefully down, and with her back to the caller, she asked just how often he and the lucky young lady went out together.
Steady.
Said Jim.
Mother's look, remaining on my face, turned into a glare of fury.
Tom didn't mention you went out with a girl.
No, I didn't mean to let the cat out of the bag. The boys at the warehouse will kid me to death when they hear the news.
He laughed heartily, but his laughter dropped heavily and awkwardly away, even as his dull senses were gradually penetrated by the unpleasant sensation the news of Betty had made.
Are you thinking of getting married?
Said Mother.
First of next month.
He told her. It took Mother several moments to pull herself together. Then she said in a dismal tone,
How nice. If Tom had only told us, we could have asked you both.
Oh, goodness.
Did something fall? I hope it wasn't the little glass horse with the horn. Is it broken?
Now it's just like all the other horses.
It's lost its...
Horn. It doesn't matter. Maybe it's a blessing in disguise. I'll just imagine he had an operation. The horn was removed to make him feel less freakish. Now he'll feel more at home with all the other horses, the ones that don't have horns.
As soon as he left, we all sat down looking dazed. Laura was the first to speak.
Wasn't he nice?
She asked. Mother turned to me.
You didn't mention he was engaged to be married.
Well, how did I know?
I thought you called him your best friend down at the warehouse.
Yes, but I didn't know he was going to be married,
How peculiar.
said Mother.
How very peculiar.
No.
Said Laura gently, getting up from the sofa. She picked up one of the records and blew on its surface a little as if it were dusty. Then she set it back down softly.
There's nothing peculiar about it. People in love take everything for granted.
What did she mean by that? I never knew. She slipped quietly back into her room and closed the door. Not very long after that, I lost my job at the warehouse. I got fired for writing a poem on the lid of a shoebox. I left St. Louis and just took to wandering around. All the cities swirled around me like leaves, brightly colored leaves, but leaves that were torn for their branches. I would have stopped, but something just kept pursuing me. It would always come upon me unawares and taking me by complete surprise. I'd walk by the lighted shorefront, and in it I'd see all these little pieces of colored glass, translucent bottles and delicate colors, like a shattered rainbow. And then, all of a sudden, my sister would take my shoulder, and I would turn around. I would look into her eyes. Oh, Laura. Laura, I meant to leave you behind. I guess I'm more faithful than I meant to be. I light a cigarette across the street, buy a drink, talk to a complete stranger. Anything to blow your candles out. For now, the world is lit by lightning. Blow out your candles, Laura. And so, goodbye.
An interview from the Paris Review, 1981. I first interviewed Williams in Chicago. He was hard at work on the production of a new play being done at the Goodman Theater, a humorous and moving work called A House Not Meant to Stand. We were in his suite, a huge 4-bedroom penthouse decorated in Moroccan style, popular in Hollywood about 1943. Williams had dubbed the place the Norma Desmond Suite after the role played by Gloria Swanson in Sunset Boulevard. It was his 70th birthday, and he followed the routine he had adhered to most of his adult life. He got up at dawn, went to his typewriter and worked, and then swam in the pool. He was tanned, having spent most of the winter in his home in Key West. He was dressed in a loose embroidered shirt, beige slacks, and soft canvas shoes. He looked 10 years younger than his age and was in an unusually happy mood. Tennessee, tell me, where did the ideas of your plays come from?
A play just seems to materialize like an apparition. It's very vague at first, then it gets clearer. As in the case of Streetcar, which came after Menagerie, I simply had the vision of a woman in her late youth. She was sitting in a chair all alone by the window with the moonlight streaming in on her desolate face. She'd been stood up by the man she planned to marry. I believe I was thinking of my sister because she was madly in love with some young man at the International Shoe Company who paid her court. He was extremely handsome, and she was profoundly in love with him. Whenever the phone would ring, she'd nearly faint. She'd think it was he calling for a date, you know. They saw each other every other night, and then one time he just didn't call anymore. That was when Rose first began to go into mental decline. From that vision, Streetcar evolved. I called it at the time Blanche's Chair in the Moon, which is a very bad title, I know. But it was from that image, you know, of a woman sitting by a window that Streetcar came to me.
And Menagerie?
The idea for Menagerie came very slowly, much more slowly than Streetcar. For example, I wrote it as a short story called Portrait of a Girl in Glass, which is, I believe, one of my best stories. I guess Menagerie grew out of the intense emotions I felt seeing my sister's mind begin to go.
Menagerie was shocking to audiences.
When I write, I don't aim to shock people, and I'm surprised when I do. But I don't think that anything that occurs in life should be omitted from art, though the artist should present it in a fashion that is artistic and not ugly. I set out to tell the truth, and sometimes the truth is shocking.
What about your mother and Miss Rose?
My mother, everyone calls her Miss Edwina, was essentially more psychotic than my sister Rose. Mother chose to have Rose's lobotomy done. My father didn't want it. In fact, he cried. It's the only time I saw him cry. He was in a state of sorrow when he learned that the operation had been performed.
And you?
I was away at college, and they just wrote me what happened. I didn't know about the operation. I'd never heard of a lobotomy. Mother was saying that it was bound to be a great success. Now, of course, it's been exposed as a very bad procedure that isn't practiced anymore. It saddened me a great deal because my sister and I cared so for each other. I cared for her more than I did my mother. But it didn't embitter me against Miss Edwina, no. I just thought she was an almost criminally foolish woman.
Why was the operation performed?
Well, Miss Rose, she expressed herself with great eloquence, but she said things that shocked Mother. Rose loved to shock Mother. I think because she had such great resentment towards Mother. One day she said, "Mother, you know, we girls at All Saints College used to abuse ourselves with the altar candles that we stole from the chapel." Mother screamed like a peacock and rushed to the head doctor. Do anything to shut her up. Just like Mrs. Venable and Suddenly last summer, you know. Except that Mother wasn't as cruel as Mrs. Venable, poor bitch. Whatever Mother did, she didn't know what she was doing. A year or so before Mother died, she believed she had a horse living in her room. She didn't like its presence at all, and she complained bitterly about this imaginary horse that had moved into the place with her. As a child, she'd always wanted a horse, and now that she finally had one, she didn't like it one bit. At the end, she changed her name. Miss Edwina dropped the A and became just Edwin Williams. That's how she signed herself. It's strange to have a mother at 94 decides to call herself Edwin.
And Miss Rose?
Miss Rose smokes too much. She's very nervous, you know. She has a curious misapprehension about things. She'll enter a restaurant and say, "How many packs of Chesterfields do you have?" "I'll take them all." When she visited me in Key West, she was trying not to smoke. So she took it upon herself to water all my trees and plants. Rose would take a glass of water from the house, water a plant with it, return, fill the glass, and go out again all day long. I found that touching, how she tried to occupy her time. One day, while in Key West, I asked Rose where she'd been. She said she'd taken a walk along the Mediterranean Sea, and she had really enjoyed the view of Italy. Lovely Miss Rose. She thinks she's Queen of England, you know. She once signed a photograph of herself to me, Rose of England. I love her. I love her so, you know, for a person like Rose, who spent many years in a state asylum, as she had to do before I got any money. Living is constantly a defensive existence.
A defensive existence.
Living is constantly a defensive existence.
In any case, you couldn't ask for a sweeter or more benign monarch than Rose, or in my opinion, one that's more of a lady.
A sweeter or more benign monarch than Rose.
Sweeter and more benign.
Or one that's more of a lady.
A lady.
A lady.
After all, high station in life is earned by the gallantry with which appalling experiences are survived with grace.
With grace.
With grace.
The gallantry with which appalling experiences are survived with grace.
Valediction by Tennessee Williams.
She went with mourning on her lips down an inscrutable dark way, and we who witnessed her eclipse have found no word to say.
I think our speechlessness is not something she would approve. She who was always light of wit and quick to speak and move.
I think that she would say goodbye and be no less a lyric word than any song, than any cry of greeting we have heard.
So, blow out your candles, Rose. And so, goodbye.